The city of Chicago had always been a place of mystery, its streets lined with whispers of the past, its air thick with the scent of old secrets. Among the many stories that drifted through the humid air like ghostly murmurs, one name was spoken with reverence and unease: Claudette Moreau, the luckiest woman alive. No one knew exactly when Claudette's luck had begun, but everyone in the city had a story about her. Some claimed she had won the Illinois lottery 3 times. Others swore she had walked away from car crashes unscathed, while everyone else involved perished. There were murmurs that she had survived a fire that consumed an entire building, stepping out of the inferno without a single burn. At first, the stories seemed like exaggerated urban legends, but as the years passed and the tales accumulated, a darker undercurrent began to seep into them. Jessica Carter had heard the stories growing up. She had dismissed them as just another thread in the rich tapestry of Chicago folklore, no different from the haunted mansions or the curses that supposedly lingered in the city's oldest neighborhoods. But now, in her late 20s, Jessica found herself drawn to Claudette in a way she couldn't explain. It had started as idle curiosity, a journalist's instinct to uncover the truth, but the more she dug, the more the details unsettled her. Everywhere Claudette went, misfortune seemed to follow, except never for her. When she boarded a cruise, a storm capsized another vessel that had left just minutes before. When she bet on a horse race, the other jockeys suffered bizarre accidents, ensuring her pick always won. Even personal relationships bore the stain of her unnatural fortune. A former lover had died in his sleep the night after they broke up, doctors unable to determine a cause. Our childhood best friend had suffered a freak accident while biking just days after a public argument between them. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence, but too inexplicable to be anything else. Jessica decided to observe Claudette firsthand. She followed her through the winding streets of the city, watching as the woman moved through life with an almost hypnotic ease. People gravitated toward her, enchanted by her charm. Yet those same people often found themselves at the receiving end of cruel, inexplicable misfortunes soon after. One evening, Jessica followed Claudette to a jazz club in the heart of downtown Chicago. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of aged bourbon and sweat, the soft glow of dim lights casting flickering shadows against the walls. Claudette took a seat at the bar, and within moments, a man beside her struck up a conversation. He was handsome, confident, his laughter rich and full. Jessica watched as Claudette smiled at him, a knowing smile, one that sent an inexplicable chill down her spine. Not more than 20 minutes later, the man excused himself to the restroom. He never returned. Moments later, sirens wailed in the distance, and a commotion stirred outside. Jessica hurried to the door, peering out into the night. A small crowd had gathered near the alleyway, murmuring in hushed voices. Pushing her way through, she saw the man's body sprawled on the pavement, his eyes wide open, a look of frozen terror etched into his features. There was no sign of injury, no blood, nothing to indicate what had killed him. Jessica turned back toward the club, heart pounding. Claudette was still at the bar, sipping her drink as if nothing had happened. When her gaze lifted and locked onto Jessica's, there was something in those eyes, something ancient, something knowing. The more Jessica watched, the more she saw, and the more she saw, the more she felt something watching her in return. Shadows seemed to move in unnatural ways when she was near Claudette. Streetlights flickered. The air grew colder. It wasn't just bad luck that surrounded the woman. It was something much worse. And then one night, Jessica received a letter slipped beneath her door. The handwriting was delicate, precise. "You see me, don't you?" She didn't sleep that night. She barely even breathed. The walls of her apartment felt too close, the silence too deep, and somewhere beyond the veil of her understanding, she felt something shifting, something dark, something inevitable. The truth about Claudette Moreau was far from simple luck, and now that Jessica had begun to uncover it, she feared she would never be able to look away. The letter burned in Jessica's hands, its words searing into her mind like a brand. She had spent the night pacing her apartment, the weight of Claudette's gaze still lingering in her thoughts. The question, "You see me, don't you?" echoed in her mind, a haunting refrain that refused to be silenced. It wasn't just a question, it was an acknowledgement, a challenge, and perhaps even a warning. Jessica knew she couldn't ignore it. She had always been drawn to the unknown, to the stories that others dismissed as too strange or too dangerous to pursue. But this was different. Claudette Moreau wasn't just a story. She was a force, a phenomenon, a living enigma wrapped in the guise of a woman. And Jessica had the sinking feeling that she had already crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The next morning, she decided to dig deeper. She started with the man from the jazz club, the one who had died so suddenly and inexplicably. His name was Marcus Delaney, a successful real estate agent with no known enemies and no history of health issues. The police had ruled his death as a heart attack, but Jessica knew better. She had seen the look on his face, the sheer terror frozen in his eyes. That wasn't the face of a man who had simply dropped dead. That was the face of someone who had seen something unimaginable. Jessica tracked down Marcus's colleagues, his friends, anyone who might have known him. The stories they told were eerily similar. Marcus had been a man of routine, predictable, and steady. But in the days leading up to his death, he had changed. He had become withdrawn, paranoid, muttering about shadows that followed him, whispers he couldn't quite make out. One friend recalled him saying, "She's always watching. She knows what I've done." Jessica's blood ran cold. She didn't need to ask who she was. As she pieced together Marcus's final days, a pattern began to emerge. He had met Claudette at a charity gala 2 weeks before his death. They had talked briefly, exchanged pleasantries and parted ways, but after that night Marcus had started to unravel. It was as if meeting Claudette had triggered something in him, something dark and inescapable. Jessica's investigation led her to others who had crossed paths with Claudette. There was a young artist named Lila who had painted a portrait of Claudette and then vanished without a trace. A retired teacher named Harold who had won a small fortune in a poker game with Claudette, only to lose his entire family in a house fire days later. A musician named Elena who had played a duet with Claudette at a local cafe and then suffered a mental breakdown, claiming that the music had opened a door she couldn't close. Each story was more chilling than the last, each one a piece of a puzzle that Jessica couldn't quite fit together. But one thing was clear. Claudette Moreau wasn't just lucky. She was something else entirely. Jessica's obsession grew with each passing day. She spent hours in libraries, scouring old newspapers and archives for any mention of Claudette. What she found was both fascinating and horrifying. Claudette's name appeared sporadically throughout Chicago's history, always tied to strange and tragic events. A fire in 1923 that destroyed an entire block, leaving only one house untouched, Claudette's. A train derailment in 1957 that killed dozens, except for a single passenger who walked away without a scratch, Claudette. A flood in 1979 that submerged half the city, but left Claudette's home dry and intact. The records went back further than Jessica had expected, stretching into the 19th century. It was impossible, of course. Claudette couldn't be that old, and yet the evidence was there, staring her in the face. Photographs, newspaper clippings, even a painting from 1882 that bore an uncanny resemblance to Claudette. The woman in the painting had the same piercing eyes, the same enigmatic smile, the same aura of quiet menace. Jessica's mind raced with possibilities. Was Claudette immortal? A ghost? Something else entirely? She didn't know, but she was determined to find out. Her search led her to an old, crumbling mansion on the outskirts of the city. It was a place that had been abandoned for decades, its windows boarded up, its walls covered in ivy. But according to the records, it had once belonged to the Moreau family. Jessica felt a thrill of anticipation as she approached the gate, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what she would find inside, but she knew it would be important. The gate creaked open with a sound that sent shivers down her spine. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the ground littered with fallen leaves and broken branches. Jessica stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The mansion loomed before her, its shadow stretching across the overgrown lawn like a dark hand reaching out to claim her. She pushed open the front door, the hinges groaning in protest. The interior was dark and musty, the furniture covered in dusty sheets, the walls lined with faded portraits of people long dead. Jessica moved through the rooms, her flashlight cutting through the darkness like a blade. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew she would recognize it when she saw it. And then, in the study, she found it. A large, ornate mirror stood against the far wall, its surface cracked and tarnished with age. But what caught Jessica's attention was the inscription carved into the frame. To see is to know, and to know is to be bound. She felt a chill run down her spine as she read the words, her reflection staring back at her from the cracked glass. And then, something moved. Jessica froze, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection in the mirror wasn't hers. It was Claudette's. The woman stood there, her eyes gleaming with a dark, malevolent light, her lips curved into a smile that made Jessica's blood run cold. "You see me, don't you?" Claudette's voice echoed through the room, soft and mocking. "So you've always seen me, and now you're mine." Jessica stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the room. The air grew colder, the shadows closing in around her. She could feel Claudette's presence, a suffocating weight pressing down on her, squeezing the breath from her lungs. And then, the mirror began to crack. The glass splintered, shards falling to the floor with a sound like breaking bones. Jessica watched in horror as something began to emerge from the mirror. Something dark and shapeless, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. It reached out for her, its touch cold and clammy, and she felt a wave of despair wash over her, a sense of hopelessness so profound it threatened to crush her. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The room was silent, the shadows receding, the air growing warm once more. Jessica looked around, her heart still racing, but the mirror was gone. The wall where it had stood was blank, as if it had never been there at all. And then she felt it. A presence, lingering at the edges of her mind, a whisper that wasn't quite a sound. It was Claudette, she realized. Claudette was inside her now, a part of her, bound to her in a way she couldn't understand. Jessica stumbled out of the mansion, her legs trembling, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and dread. The night air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the city itself was aware of the shift that had taken place. She glanced over her shoulder at the crumbling mansion, its silhouette looming like a specter against the moonlit sky. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in one of the upper windows, watching her with those same piercing eyes. But when she blinked, it was gone. The walk back to her apartment was a blur. Every sound, the distant wail of a siren, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the faint hum of streetlights, felt amplified, as if the world was closing in on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her, something unseen but undeniably present. When she finally reached her apartment, she locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. For days, Jessica tried to convince herself that what had happened in the mansion was a hallucination, a product of exhaustion and stress. But deep down, she knew better. She could feel Claudette's presence, a faint but persistent hum in the back of her mind, like a song she couldn't quite place. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew stronger with each passing day. And then, the luck began. It started small. Jessica found a $20 bill on the sidewalk. Her favorite coffee shop gave her a free pastry with her order. A co-worker she disliked suddenly transferred to another department. At first, she dismissed these things as coincidences, but they kept happening. She won a raffle at a charity event. A taxi pulled up just as she stepped out into the rain. A promotion she hadn't even applied for was offered to her, but with the luck came the disasters. Her co-worker who transferred, her replacement was killed in a hit-and-run just days after starting. The taxi driver who picked Jessica up, he was found dead in his cab the next morning, the cause of death unknown. The charity event where she won the raffle. A gas leak caused an explosion hours after she left, injuring dozens. Jessica tried to rationalize it, to tell herself that these tragedies were unrelated, that they weren't her fault. But the pattern was too clear, too consistent. Every stroke of luck she experienced was followed by a wave of misfortune for those around her. It was as if the universe was balancing the scales, and Jessica was the fulcrum. She began to isolate herself, afraid of what might happen to anyone who got too close. She stopped answering calls from friends and family, stopped going out except when absolutely necessary, but even then, the luck and the disasters continued. A delivery driver slipped and broke his leg while bringing her groceries. A neighbor's apartment caught fire after Jessica complimented her on her new curtains. A stray dog that had followed her home was hit by a car the next day. The guilt was unbearable. Jessica felt like a curse, a harbinger of doom. She tried to fight it, to resist the luck, but it was no use. The more she tried to avoid it, the more it seemed to seek her out. She couldn't escape it, couldn't control it. It was as if Claudette's presence within her was guiding her, shaping her life in ways she couldn't comprehend. And then, the dreams began. They were vivid, unsettling, filled with images of Claudette and the mansion. In one dream, Jessica stood before the cracked mirror, watching as her reflection morphed into Claudette's. In another, she wandered the halls of the mansion, hearing whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The dreams always ended the same way, with Claudette's voice soft and mocking, saying, "You're mine now." Jessica's waking hours became a blur of exhaustion and paranoia. She stopped sleeping, afraid of what she might see in her dreams. She spent her nights pacing her apartment, staring out the window at the city below. The once familiar streets now seemed alien, menacing, as if they were hiding secrets she wasn't meant to know. One night, as she sat by the window, she noticed a figure standing on the sidewalk below. It was a woman, her face obscured by the shadows, but Jessica knew who it was. Claudette. She felt a surge of panic, her heart racing as she watched the figure raise a hand and point directly at her. Jessica stumbled back from the window, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she looked again, the figure was gone, but the message was clear. Claudette wasn't gone. She was still here, still watching, still waiting. Jessica's life spiraled further out of control. The luck grew more extreme, the disasters more devastating. She won a luxury car in a contest, only for the dealership to burn down the next day. She was invited to an exclusive gala, where a chandelier fell and injured several guests. She found a lost wallet filled with cash, and the owner was later found dead in an alley. The people around her began to notice. Friends and co-workers started to avoid her, their eyes filled with suspicion and fear. Strangers on the street seemed to sense something off about her, giving her wide berth as she passed. Even her landlord began to look at her strangely, as if he could feel the darkness that surrounded her. Jessica tried to find answers, to understand what was happening to her. She returned to the mansion, but it was gone, as if it had never existed. She searched for records of Claudette, but they were all gone too, erased from history as if by some unseen hand. It was as if Claudette had never been real, as if she had always been a figment of Jessica's imagination. But Jessica knew better. Claudette was real, and she was still here. The final straw came when Jessica's mother called. They hadn't spoken in weeks, not since Jessica had started isolating herself. Her mother's voice was filled with concern, but also something else, something Jessica couldn't quite place. "Jessica, I need to see you," her mother said. "Something's happened." Jessica's heart sank. She knew what was coming, but she couldn't bring herself to ask. She simply nodded, even though her mother couldn't see her, and agreed to meet. When she arrived at her mother's house, she found it in chaos. Her father had been rushed to the hospital after a sudden heart attack. Her mother was distraught, her hands shaking as she clutched a cup of tea. Jessica felt a wave of guilt so profound, it nearly knocked her off her feet. She knew, without a doubt, that this was her fault. As she sat by her father's hospital bed that night, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, Jessica made a decision. She couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep bringing disaster to everyone she cared about. She had to find a way to break free of Claudette's influence, no matter the cost. Jessica sat in the sterile hospital room, her father's labored breathing filling the silence. The guilt was a weight she could no longer carry. She had brought this upon him, upon everyone she cared about. Claudette's presence within her was a parasite, feeding on her life and spreading destruction in its wake. Jessica knew she couldn't let it continue. But how could she fight something she didn't fully understand? The answer came to her in a moment of clarity, as if whispered by the shadows themselves. If Claudette was bound to her, then perhaps the only way to break the bond was to sever it entirely. Jessica didn't know if it would work, but she had no other options left. She had to try. She left the hospital that night, her mind made up. The city felt different as she walked through its streets, the air thick with an almost tangible tension. The lights flickered as she passed, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward her, as if aware of her plan. Jessica ignored them, her focus unwavering. She had one destination in mind: the river. The Chicago River was dark and cold, its surface rippling faintly under the pale glow of the moon. Jessica stood on the edge of the bridge, staring down into the water. She could feel Claudette's presence stirring within her, a faint but insistent hum that grew louder with each passing second. It was as if Claudette knew what she was planning and was trying to stop her. "You can't escape me," Claudette's voice echoed in her mind, soft and mocking. "You're mine now." Jessica clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "No," she whispered. "I'm not yours. Not anymore." She took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs. For a moment she hesitated, the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her. But then she thought of her father, lying in that hospital bed. She thought of all the people who had suffered because of her, all the lives that had been destroyed. She couldn't let it continue, she wouldn't. With a final shuddering breath, Jessica stepped off the bridge. The water was icy, the shock of it stealing her breath as she plunged beneath the surface. She fought against the current, her limbs heavy and uncooperative. The darkness closed in around her, the cold seeping into her bones. But even as her body struggled, her mind was eerily calm. She could feel Claudette's presence within her, a dark, writhing mass that seemed to pulse with panic. "You can't," Claudette's voice hissed, louder now, more desperate. "You can't leave me." Jessica didn't respond. She let herself sink deeper, the water pressing in on all sides. She could feel Claudette's grip on her weakening, the bond between them fraying as the cold and the darkness took hold. It was working. She was breaking free. But then, something changed. The water around her seemed to grow colder, darker, as if the river itself was alive and aware. Jessica felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, a fear so profound it threatened to consume her. She tried to move, to swim to the surface, but her body wouldn't obey. She was trapped, suspended in the icy depths, and then she saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, its form shifting and indistinct like smoke in water. It was Claudette, but not as Jessica had ever seen her. Her eyes glowed with a malevolent light, her smile twisted and cruel. She reached out, her fingers brushing against Jessica's cheek, and Jessica felt a wave of despair so profound it nearly broke her. "You thought you could escape me," Claudette whispered, her voice echoing in Jessica's mind. "But you can't. You'll never be free." Jessica tried to scream, but the water filled her lungs, choking her. She could feel Claudette's presence growing stronger, the bond between them tightening once more. She had failed. Claudette had won. As the darkness closed in around her, Jessica's final thought was of her father. She hoped he would be okay. She hoped he would never know what had happened to her. And then there was nothing. The next morning, the city awoke to the news of a body found in the river. It was Jessica Carter, a young journalist who had been missing for days. But as the days passed, the city moved on, as it always did. Life continued, the streets bustling with activity, the air filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation. The stories started small, as they always did. A woman who had won the lottery 3 times in a row. Her survivor of a devastating fire that had claimed dozens of lives, a figure who seemed to walk through life untouched by misfortune, while those around her suffered. A name began to circulate, whispered in hushed tones, spoken with a mixture of awe and unease. Claudette Moreau.